Zachy the Sun is your host on this most epic journey through pop culture's past. Hold on to your butts. This is Nostalgia Theater.
Brought to you by the Movie Film Podcast.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the show. This is Zachy, and you're listening to Nostalgia Theater. Now, 25 years ago, the Fox Network debuted the X-Men animated series as part of its Saturday morning lineup, along with Batman, the animated series, which had premiered 2 months earlier. This was really a turning point in terms of how action and adventure shows were presented for animation, and it was a real leap forward for complex, serialized storytelling, which had basically been unheard of in American animation outside of imported shows like Robotech in the mid-'80s. Now, I came at the X-Men cartoon as someone who, at 12 going on 13, I had been a die-hard fan of the Marvel Comics for a few years by that point, so when the series showed up, completely out of the blue in a pre-internet age, its very existence was enough to blow my hair back. Now that said, while it was an instant sensation upon its release, the road to getting X-Men to the screen was no easy feat, and here to discuss that with me are writer-producers Eric and Julia Lewald, who were instrumental in making X-Men what it was. Eric has a new book out entitled Previously on X-Men, which offers behind-the-scenes perspectives on getting the show to the air. Eric and Julia, thank you so much for coming on Nostalgia Theater.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Zachy.
So, X-Men, now here we are 25 years later. Did you think that when the show was being made, that a quarter century later you'd be still sort of discussing the footprint that it left behind?
You know, at the time, it was, believe it or not, it was just another job that we got at the last second and had no warning about, and just dove into and tried to do the work, you know, as best we could, as we would any other show. But
it was a happy blur, but it was a blur.
yeah, and as often happens out here, we got started a month or two later than we should have. So it was okay, quick, let's get this done. And so at the time, all we were thinking about was hitting our deadlines, and not a whole lot more.
Now you came at the show. You had been both of you were on the Disney afternoon shows.
Oh yes, happy days.
Yeah, that's where we met when working on the Disney afternoon shows.
Oh wow, that's where you met. Okay, so that was, we're talking late '80s, early '90s.
Correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'd started a couple of years earlier. I'd been on Hanna-Barbera staff for about a year and a half, and got on Disney, and then in late '87, Julie joined in '88, and then we moved on from there. After that, there weren't a whole lot of staff jobs around, so as almost everybody else in our business, we just have been working freelance show to show. Which
was incredibly terrifying at the time and remains so.
Yeah.
But, you know, again, dumb luck of the draw when Eric happened to get a call one night to go in for one show, and that kind of changed things for us, so yeah.
Now, adventure cartoons had been around for a while. I feel like there had been a lull, but I mean, certainly in the 80s, there was a lot of the licensed shows. I mean, I know you worked on GoBots and Bionic 6. Bionic 6 was a huge show for me. I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and that was, they showed every episode over there.
Really? It's interesting. Yeah. The Bionic 6 TMS is a Japanese company, and they had a little tiny office here with 4 or 5 people in it, and I worked there for 9 months on staff, just as their development staff. And by chance, the guy there that I was working for when we got that show going was Sidney Iwander, who ended up being the exec at Fox that supervised X-Men and Batman. So that's how I met him, doing development for him. We sold one other show. I think it was called Galaxy High when I was there, but it was this tiny office, and just basically writing stuff for Sidney, and that was good experience. But yeah, Bionic 6, that was early.
It's weird how that show has sort of dropped down the memory hole, because they've never released it on DVD, and I feel like it's this little gem that's waiting to be rediscovered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So with X-Men, at what point did you join the process?
Well, the X-Men is really, as the book lays out was the baby of one person. It was just the vision of one person. Her name's Margaret Lesh, and she was, at the time, had just been recently named the president of Fox Kids Television. And she'd been working at Hanna-Barbera in the late 70s, and then as an independent producer for Marvel and other people in the earlier 80s, and had produced an awful lot of good shows. She was a really quality.
She spearheaded the pilot, the Pride of the X-Men pilot from.
Right. In fact, she, in the early 80s, she'd realized, she was having trouble with Marvel. No one would buy Marvel shows.
She was working. I want to clarify. She was working for Marvel at the time.
For Marvel Productions, the New World company out here in L.A., to try to get animated shows on, and they'd sell other stuff like Muppet Babies and really successful shows, really excellent shows. But no one, Marvel was just, who'd want to watch that?
And why is that? Do you think?
Well, I just think Hollywood's a small place, and there, who knows how people get in decision-making positions. But I think one of the things is they tried off and on since the mid '60s to do Marvel shows, and they tried, since the '40s to do occasional, superhero movies. And to Hollywood's eyes, they just, maybe one Superman movie would make a little money, and then the next two wouldn't work, and everyone forget about them for a decade. And certainly the attempts at Marvel TV, I think the people out here didn't know why people read comic books, didn't understand the intense heroic nature of the storytelling. And so they get a chance to do a Marvel show, and you get, Spider-Man and a pet dog or something, and you wouldn't get what was the spirit of the books, which was, really heroic storytelling. And they just didn't get it. And so when they tried to make a show, it would crash and burn, and so it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, this stuff doesn't work in television and movies, so why even bother? Stop bothering us with this stuff, Margaret. And she pushed it for 7 or 8 years to get the show on. No one would touch it.
Wow.
And the X-Men, because she was convinced it was the best Marvel property. So when she got her job at Fox, the first 2 shows she wanted to do were X-Men and Batman. And Batman had a studio behind it at the time. At the time, Marvel was a tiny was really kind of struggling and about to go bankrupt comic book company without a studio behind it. So Batman got funded first, about a year before we did. And so those were her. She decided, okay, well, if I'm going to start a kids network, these are going to be my top 2. And it was all her doing, getting out in the air. And even when she became president of the network, her immediate boss said, "I don't get this. Our advertisers aren't going to get it. It's too adult. It's too serious. There's no laughs. Why should I let you do this show?" And she just said, "Because I believe it would be the best show on television." And he said, "Okay, is it worth your job if you fail?" And she said, "Okay, let's do it." And she actually was one of those put your ass on the line moments.
You're not going to hear, you're not going to hear much praise for TV executives from practically anybody anyway, but in the story of X-Men, the animated series, there are rightfully some amazing people who truly did, at various times during the making of this show, put their job on the line.
Yeah, she made it happen. She just she hired 3 or 4 people. She decided we're going to be the talent, quote, creative side of it. Will Mineo and Larry Houston and me, and Mark Eden's my number 1 writer. But it was her doing that the show got on the air at all. There never would have been a Marvel show on television if it weren't for her insistence on it happening.
What's amazing about what you're saying is that you can draw a straight line from the X-Men animated series to where we are now, where you put the Marvel name on a product and it's an instant sale. I mean, it has instant buy-in, and it's just, you don't even need to connect too many dots.
Oh, you're preaching to the choir here. You just hit on one of my favorite things to harp on these days. And my point is, yes, there was a Marvel universe before X-Men, the animated series. That's where all this came from. 30 years of comic books, 30 years of all this. And now today there's a billion-dollar superhero franchise industry. But the connecting material, the bridge between those 2 universes, I truly believe is X-Men, the animated series, because that's what introduced a lot of people who were not comic book readers to the Marvel world, and from there developed this huge base of folks who now love that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it may have been a cartoon show, it may have been Saturday morning, but it still has its place of honor, I believe.
Yeah.
Now, did you come at the show as fans?
No. This is one of the fun parts. The supervising producer, Will Minio, who designed and really was like the heart and soul of making the first year what it was, and establishing the show as what it was. He was a big fan. He was like, from the time he could crawl, he was a Marvel fan. Larry Houston, who was the producer-director of the first 4 seasons, also, he was a X-Men encyclopedia. I and Mark Edens, who were responsible for laying out the first 2 seasons of stories, we couldn't have told you who were in the X-Men.
Huh.
I mean, I'd read some comic books when I was younger, but the reason we got the job was we had done a series, a year of Beetlejuice for Fox, for Sidney Iwanter and Margaret Lesh, and they really liked the writing style and thought we'd be the best tool, and that's it. Yeah, I got the call the night before the big Greenlight meeting with Chaim Saban and Stan Lee and all the Marvel people, and was told, Eric, you're going to come in and you're going to be responsible for developing and setting up, and you and Mark for the writing of this show. And it's all about the X-Men. And I said, well, tell me who they are. and this was before the internet, so I couldn't Google it.
Right.
And you couldn't go get back issues. You'd have to go down to the comic book store and dig through and hope you're finding the right ones. Luckily, as I say, Larry and Will knew their stuff, and Bob Harris, who was the head of all things X-Men at Marvel at the time, was our creative advisor for me and answered all my questions. And there were other writers that ended up writing for the show that also really knew the books, and so I could run stuff. Would Wolverine do this? Does this fit the world we're talking about?
I have to jump in here though, because there were folks who were hardcore, as we say, fanboys, working in various capacities on the project. And occasionally, some of us who didn't know the property that well would have to ask, how would Storm handle this, or could XYZ behave in this manner? And sometimes the answer would be adamant. Are you out of your mind? No, that could never happen. And it's like, okay, somehow we got to find a middle ground here, a balance, because this thing needs to happen and it needs to be with this character. So yeah, there was a certain amount of negotiating.
The balance was that I and Mark Edens were just focused on telling the most intense, dramatic stories we could tell, and everybody else was making sure they were X-Men canon correct. And we learned real quick. I mean, you're telling these stories and you're digging through the reference books and stuff. I think the Marvel Universe books of the middle '80s, to find out who means what to whom, and all of it. So it ended up being a really nice partnership between us that we're just wanting to make sure this, because you get a fan who would pitch a story and he'd have 87 mutants in it because he was so excited about seeing all these people from the books and what their powers were and what they meant to each other. And you just have to calm them down and say, we've got room for 6. And so in telling the story, come on, let's find a balance here. Let's make the 6 as exciting as we can and true to canon as we can, but calm down, everybody, because there's a manic side to fandom that I think can get in the way of TV story. You got 22 minutes. You have to keep the stuff simple.
Well, and one can only imagine what the reaction online would be were the show to have begun airing today. Given how Twitter crusaders.
I got to be as hamstring as we were in terms of not having access to material or ability to communicate quickly back then. It was, looking back now, it was a tremendous gift to not have to have those the potentially negative voices, screaming at us as, on the production side of things. You're owning this character. How dare you? That didn't happen.
Yeah.
And I think as a result, and also for folks watching it, for example, you as a younger person, there wasn't a place to go online instantly and find each other. If you connected with folks who watched it like Monday at school or on the playground. There was a certain sense of community and fellowship in person that I find kind of refreshing and kind of miss these days. That
it's
folks
true.
don't have that sort of what's the word? Not command viewing, but must-see TV at that appointment viewing at that tender age.
Yeah,
so,
and I mean, just the idea of, I mean, in the streaming age, we've lost just like this is a show that the entire country is watching at this time.
Yeah,
and everyone is experiencing it at the same time.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
And that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, we didn't realize this till I looked back for the book, but there were Saturdays where we'd get over half the country of the TVs that were on during our time period. 55-60% would be watching X-Men, and that meant all those kids were talking to each other.
That's amazing. Now you mentioned obviously the problems and the struggle that Margaret Loesch had just trying to sell the network on it. Now, on top of that, so you have these characters that are not known to the vast majority of the population. This is not Spider-Man or the Hulk. The X-Men was always, like, even as a comic reader, like, it was a mark of how deep of a comic reader you are if you were an X-Men fan. So this is stuff nobody's heard of. But on top of that, you're going serialized. Which was, as far as I know, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, that's the title of the book, Previously on X-Men. In other words, that's one of the most identifying aspects of the show was the serialization. Now, this was uncharted territory on Saturday morning, as far as I know. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, to the best of our knowledge, the one that I make reference to is one of the great classics, and it was only partially serialized, and that was Rocky and Bullwinkle back around 1960.
Oh, how funny.
And what they do is they'd be like an old serial. They do 10 5-minute bits of a story over 10 weeks, and then they'd have secondary things like Dudley Do-Right or Fractured Fairy Tales to fill in.
Right.
But they would have this connected thing, and they would say, "Last time you remember." And,
the great William Conrad doing the narration.
Yes, right, exactly. So that was, as talk about early influences. I mean, that was almost. They had such low budgets for Bullwinkle. I met a couple people who worked on it. It was such, but they had this incredibly free spirit making it. They basically no oversight, it seemed, and they had that in a bit of their show. But yes, it was again Will Mineo, the writers, Mark and I would die. I mean, we prefer doing it. It's like being able to do a novel rather than a bunch of little short stories. Being able to do something serialized, we loved the opportunity, but the person that made it happen was Will Mineo, because he went to Margaret Loesch and said, "This is what the comic book experience is like. We're trying to do a show that's as close to and respects the comic book source. And the first thing all of our people will tell you, oh no, this is terrible, we can't do this, animation takes 7 months to produce, and if episode 3 is broken and needs to be redone, we can't show 4, 5, or 6 while we're waiting. It's a terrible disaster waiting to happen." And that, in fact, did happen. It's one of the reasons we were supposed to premiere in September with Batman.
Yeah. And
teething problems got us up to about a couple months of delay. And then episode 3 or 4 came back, and it really wasn't working. And so she said, "Okay, we're waiting until January. We're gonna premiere in mid-season," which nobody did back then.
This was a huge risk because every one of the affiliates had been sold on Batman and X-Men arriving as their big fall premieres, and for her this had never been done before in terms of a network rescheduling a show like this and doing it in this manner.
My recollection is that I mean you had the 2-part opener, and then there was like a viewer choice marathon of like favorite shows on Thanksgiving, I think it was, and X-Men ended up being the number 1 pick, and they showed it was the Magneto episode, right? I'm digging back, but that's my recollection.
That's exactly what happened. They had as a promotion, which of our shows on Fox do you like best? And all the other shows have been on many times, and X-Men had just had that one little sneak preview. And from what we're told from the PR people, X-Men got many more votes than all the rest of the shows put together.
Wow. So
that's why I played again.
This is fascinating to me because as you say, I mean, the Batman show had just started, and that came in with a huge amount of critical acclaim, and really, I mean, the animation was really being singled out. And obviously to this day that show holds very high esteem. At the time, did you view that show like, were you looking at it like, oh, these guys are the competitors, and were you kind of circling each other, or how did that work?
I'm going to say that it was a sort of more like sibling rivalry,
okay.
but good-natured in the sense that, my God, the talent over at Warner Brothers,
and the budgets, we were so envious, and of course it's a small community of writers and artists out here in animation, so we all knew each other. Will Mineo and Larry Houston had worked on some Batman storyboards while they were waiting for X-Men to get picked up, and so we, we're friends, and they were aware. That's what Will made the decision when he realized how small our budgets were and how tight our deadlines were. He said, "Look, we are never going to be able to look half as good as they are, and they are our competition. There are 40 other shows on, none of them matter. That's the one thing we're going to be held up to. So we have to give it a different pace." He literally, in terms of shots per episode, he said he nearly doubled the Batman pace in terms of boom, 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 boom. He says we have to give it, because if we linger on our animation, everybody's going to see how limited
yeah.
and unfixed and compromised and lower budget it is. We can't compete on that. So what we're going to compete with is energy and dramatic storytelling, and push that, so people won't have time to think, well, maybe Beast's design in the third act wasn't quite as good as his design in the first act. There's just no time for that, because you're on to the next crisis. And that was very much planned in from the beginning, on the production side, knowing that we couldn't compete with them financially or in terms of the look.
So that was actually a question that I had. I mean, you allude to obviously the many animation problems. I look at the character designs, and they are like, when you look at the model sheets, there were these beautiful evocations of the Jim Lee costumes and everything from that time. Do you feel like the animation was hamstrung a little bit by the character designs being so detailed?
I'm going to step in and say I think it was hamstrung because of budget.
Okay, fair enough.
With enough money, and enough time, everything could have been interpreted, gloriously. But it was a patched together co-production. Eric, how many different entities?
There were Graz Entertainment had the artists, and Saban was kind of organizing about half of it, and then in our Korean studio,
and Fox Kids had money in it.
Fox. It was Fox Kids' baby creatively. They really had the leverage. If when push came to shove, if Fox wanted something, Fox got something, and then Marvel. But Marvel had such terrible experience with previous Hollywood stuff. They were kind of, oh, great. Somebody wants to pay us a little money, and maybe we can get some PR for our books with this.
How things change.
Yeah, they did exactly. It was the exact opposite. There was no, even if, unless something was so complete, I can't think of a thing that Marvel said, oh, we can't live with this. There was never that. It was like, well, we don't like this, and we'd say, well, gee, we're sorry. That's the way the episode's going to be next, because they were focused on getting their books out, and as I say, they were a small company with financial problems at the time, and they didn't have the minutes in the day to supervise really creatively.
Now, as far as the show itself, I mean, you mentioned, I mean, the universe of mutant characters to pull from. I mean, it's nigh on limitless. How did you decide which X-Men to make regulars? Because there were some that were recurring or whatever, but you had your core cast. How did you end up with them?
Well, that was at the beginning, at that big first meeting where we had everybody together and decide what's the show going to be. There was immediate talk about that. Okay, who's going to be because that's was the key to the show, and there were half a dozen. It was as far as from the writer's point of view, all we were caring about was that we'd have a real distinct, complementary crew, that everybody is different from each other as possible, so that nobody was repeating. It's one reason we didn't end up with Cable as the main guy, because he was too, would he and Wolverine just growl at each other for 5 minutes? It's just, why duplicate? Have as big a variety so we can tell as many stories. That was the writer's interest. Marvel's interest was that they had certain people they wanted to push. Obviously, Xavier and Cyclops and Wolverine were givens. That was just a start. And Storm was big at the time. Gambit and Jubilee were two that, Gambit was pretty new and somebody that Marvel was pushing, and we looked at him and we said, well, he's completely different from the rest of them, so we like him too as somebody that's distinct. And to be honest, when we first left that meeting and started writing up the first 13 episodes, they'd put people like Beast and Jean Grey and even Xavier as secondary or tertiary characters.
Wow.
They just said, if we see Beast once or twice during the first 13 stories, that's fine. We don't really need. And so what happened was, as we were writing, Mark and I were writing up the stories, certain characters just asserted themselves. Xavier, because he was the heart and soul of the team. I mean, you're trying to get across why people are X-Men to viewers, 80% of whom didn't know who X-Men were. It's kind of hard to do without Xavier. And so he asserted himself, and Jean asserted herself because everybody seemed to have a good relationship with her. She had some sort of moral center for the team. Right. And Wolverine had a relationship with her and respect for her, and Xavier did, and Storm did, and everybody seemed to be able to talk to her in ways that they couldn't talk to other people. So she asserted herself. And then Beast, he's just so damn much fun to write for. All of the writers wanted to keep writing for him. So, that's why he was in prison the first season, is we were just going to have him arrested after the second episode and not see him for 5 or 6 episodes. But we kept on wanting to write him. and he just made himself a regular by, if you look at some of the early PR stuff, like at the back of the book, when you get the book, there's the initial PR, I think a Neil Adams art of the team. Beast's not on it because he wasn't chosen that first day, by the executives and the business partners as somebody that had to be in the show. But the writers just said, "Screw that! He's going to be a regular."
It's interesting you mentioned Cable, because I watched the series with my kids about a year or so ago, and my second, who he was like 7 at the time, he was like humming the Cable like theme music, like there was like like specifically he had like his own thematic material, and I'm like, what is that? He's like, oh, it's the Cable music. I'm like, wow. how do you pick up on that? And I think that goes to, I mean, that was the strength of the show to me, is that even the fact that Cable was sort of a recurring guest star, you still had his theme, and there was still his storyline. I mean, I think that there were so many layers working there,
Yeah, absolutely.
So obviously with all of the storylines that you're covering, I mean, I feel like you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you were probably butting up against standards and practices if you're here talking about racism and prejudice and all this stuff. Hey, this is not Saturday morning stuff, right?
This, oh my God, the very fact that X-Men got on the air sometimes just stuns me. And again, you're not going to hear many executives spoken of kindly, but the woman in charge of standards and practices over at Fox Kids, a gal named Avery Coburn, deserves all the credit in the world for not just saying, oh, we're shutting this down, but instead understanding what the property was, understanding what everyone was striving to do, and allowing it to be the mature show that it was in a way that didn't pander to anybody, but didn't shy away from really tough issues. But even in the context of that, as Eric well remembers, there were the things that we can point out and say, okay, we were allowed to do this, but not do that. It does make one laugh, especially in a world of superheroes who all have the ability to destroy each other. Oh, and a little jealousy with Batman there.
What are some of the things?
So some of the stuff. Well, we look back and but again, as Julia said, Avery was great because she actually liked and respected the books, and realized, these are adults with adult concerns, and that's a big complaint with us in Hollywood, is that you're asked to do a show, and then you're not allowed to do it. The example I use in the book is at Hanna-Barbera. We were doing a Popeye show, and I said, the Fleischer Popeyes from the 30s are wonderful. I love that guy. And they said, he and Bluto can't fight. They can't hit each other. And you just stare at them and say, why are you having me write Popeye if I can't write Popeye? And so luckily, Avery understood this, but there were some of the things that just lists of things. Well, you can't talk about death, and you can't show it, of course. You can't use the word die. You can't have any blood. You can't have anybody hitting anybody in the face. You can't. If somebody falls into a river, you have to show that they're okay, that they haven't drowned, because you don't want to upset the children, and just endless lists of things that we've dealt with on other shows. And if you're doing a gentle little school time show, it's one thing, but as Julia said, if you're having these larger than life people fighting to save cities, and you're trying to find a way to do it without anybody ever hitting each other or having any recognizable weapons. That's why some of the weapons look so goofy on cartoons, because they'll let you shoot from an odd-looking, a bad-looking gun that has a ray come out of it. They won't let you shoot with a realistic-looking gun because, imitable behavior or something.
Unless you're Batman.
Batman crossed some of the lines further than we did, but
to their credit, they did it incredibly well, and it wasn't gratuitous. It was
they probably had more struggle with BS&P because there's something about fantasy violence that they're more accepting of out here. That if it's a little over the top and unrealistic, it's different than a tough guy with a Thompson machine gun shooting at somebody. It's not. And I don't know. I don't understand the psychology about why knocking someone through a wall with a ray rather than a bullet is acceptable, but it is. And there was another thing. We couldn't the primary reason, one of two reasons we used the Sentinels as the main villains in the first season was Wolverine can rip them to hell because they're robots.
Yes. God bless the Sentinels.
And he can't do that to any other adversary,
right?
Because the other adversaries are flesh and blood, and you can't do that. And so everybody, it's also, we thought it was a really nice incarnation of humanity's intolerance and subjugation of the mutants. It was just this walking, talking thing that proves the mutants' case. But the animators' side of it was, okay, we're going to have all this action with these Sentinels and just destroy them by the boatload, and that's okay because they're robots.
It makes sense. Wolverine, his whole deal is he has these razor-sharp claws, and it's like, okay, how is he supposed to use the claws without actually using them? That's like the eternal dilemma, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Exactly. One of my favorite notes, BS&P-wise, was during a section when things were happening in Savage Land, which I think was season 2. Is that right? That for the whole season, Charles and Magneto are stuck together in Savage Land. There's a moment where a dinosaur gets knocked into a volcano. Okay, but the note came back, we have to see the dinosaur climbing out of the volcano unharmed. To which point it was pointed out that can we at least acknowledge that dinosaurs are extinct? So if one of them dies in a cartoon, it's actually already happened in 3 million years ago. Those kind of arguments.
She didn't fall for that.
We still had to show them climbing out.
You didn't still have to climb it.
Yeah, about that, yeah.
So at what point in this project, now you mentioned that, by Thanksgiving you knew the show was a huge fan favorite. At what point does it really hit you that this is kind of a seismic success?
I think it was more like about a month into the run, like say early February. It started, I think, the 8th or 9th of January was the first official premiere, because when we had the couple of sneaks, there was good reaction to them, and we liked them, but it was almost like they were, say holiday specials or something. Okay, it's a one-off, and people seemed to be responding, but then within a couple of weeks, it was the number one show on Saturday morning. We said, "Oh, it is real," and we were getting the cover of Variety and the cover of the Hollywood Reporter, and all this stuff, and getting huge ratings. That's what it hit us. At the same time, it's odd to remember back. When the show premiered, we weren't even officially working on it, because the entire creative staff was let go after the first season.
We were all considered freelance. We were all hired on for either an episode to write it or for the run of the 13 episodes. There was no...
they really didn't think it was going to be successful. So
wow.
in the history of Hollywood, you never set it up where you don't have a contract, in case the show goes forward for the next 5 years, you're required to do it for this salary. We all had what we thought was leverage. Oh, we got the number one show in TV for kids. Let's renegotiate our contracts. And to his credit, Chaim Saban told Fox, Eric said he would do it for the same money, which of course I hadn't. And we were fighting for it. And I was trying to get like a 10% raise, not a friend's raise where you add a zero at the end, but try to get a 10% raise for giving them their number one hit on television. And when smoke cleared, Saban had cut the writers' fees by $500.
Yep,
wow.
And told us, hey, it's a number one hit show. You'll be happy to write on it for less.
Yeah,
and if not, there's a line of people out the door who will.
Yeah, everybody wanted to write for a hit show, so I'll pay less and still get good writers.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So it's one of the only number one hits in history that made the salaries go down after.
That's crazy. I mean, that's got to be discouraging, because it's like you're like a barista at Starbucks. Like, oh, okay, you want to quit? Here's somebody else to like. That's got to feel terrible.
Yeah. It didn't feel good, but there was tremendous satisfaction in the success the show itself was enjoying, and by this time, a small kind of family operation with the same friends, interacting on the writing side and on the art side, and so there was a nice sense of communion that way, and community for us.
Yeah. Now, with the successes, they say success has many parents, but failure is an orphan, right? So the show becomes a smash. At that point, are there more fingers in the pie creatively, or were you left alone to keep doing what you were doing?
It was the reverse. It was the reverse of the usual thing. That first, I'd say half of the history in my book is just of the first season, getting it to the screen, and after that it was pretty smooth sailing. What had happened was, since animation takes forever, you write a script and then there's 6 or 8 weeks to do the storyboard, and then 3 or 4 months to do the animation. So 6 months later, you get a chance to see what you've written. And we didn't even have the money for things like animatics to check how it was going to look. And we'd hear the voice recording. But so say it's 6 months later, finally, and in our case it was longer because of the production delays. During all that time, everybody involved that feels like they have a creative opinion, it feels justified in saying, no, you're doing it all wrong. We need to dumb it down, or make it funnier, or make it younger, or add this or subtract this, or you're gonna ruin the show if you keep doing it the way you're doing it. Everybody felt comfortable with creative suggestions up until the time it was a huge success, and then as soon as it was a number one hit, we could just shrug and say, well, we've proven our way of doing it is incredibly successful. Don't mess with it. And so we didn't get any we were just let to do the way we wanted to after it was shown successful.
So the show wound down in 97. Was that always the planned run, or was it just something like it? Eventually the audience just kind of started to dwindle?
It didn't dwindle. It was still doing, but the problem was had been various changes in ownership at Fox, and I think Saban had bought in and had at that time had owned, and there were two things going on. Either there's 65 episodes, which, as you know, is forever was a golden standard for animated shows. If you do 65, then you can syndicate them, show them 4 times a year. So we all thought it was going to end at 65, and then for some reason they decided they needed to do 11 more. I don't know, it was some sort of video deal or who knows. And even, Margaret, I asked Margaret, she doesn't know why they did 11 more. And then it ended because I think whoever was making the financial decision saying, well, I've got other shows I've got more of a stake in, or, whatever it was, and I think it ended pretty much where it needed to. We'd lost Larry Houston, who was, for the first 4 years, was the writer. Was the producer director in charge of the storyboards, and he was. And I think we'd had a pretty good run, but
you had set up a way out for the series at the end of the 65 with what was to have been the wrap up for the show, and you might.
Yeah.
You planned. Yes, go ahead, please.
Right. Yeah, just so we got Mark Edens back, who had done helped lay out the Phoenix Saga, the Dark Phoenix Saga, in the first 2 seasons with me, to do a big ending show for the end of and it was the Axis of Time show, Beyond Good and Evil. It was going to be a big 4-parter to just blow it out and end up having 5 X-Men leave and 4 new X-Men come in, and that was going to be the end of things. And we'd written it all, 160-page script for 4 episodes. It was all set up, and I think Gene and Xavier and Scott and Storm and Jubilee were all leaving, and Bishop and Shard were going to be caught there in this time period, so they joined the X-Men, and
along with
Psylocke and Archangel.
So that would have been how the series ended, and it would have been left to the viewers to sort of, this is where they're going to go now, and imagine the stories now.
And goodbye. But then we got the phone call saying, "Oops, sorry, we need 11 more episodes." So all that setup you've done in the story to get rid of 5 and to add 4, turn that all around and have everybody end up where they started at the beginning. So that was a tough phone call because, Mark had set up a really tight story to make it make sense that 5 were going to leave and 4 were going to join, and now it just was
So when I look at the storylines that you were able to adapt, I mean, you got Days of Future Past, I mean, you did the Phoenix story. Basically, you got Genosha, all of like the iconic beats. How did you go about determining what stories you adapted and how you adapted them? Because, for example, Days of Future Past, you switched out, you put Bishop in instead of whoever the character was in the comic. I think it was Kitty Pryde in the comics.
Yeah.
So how did you make those decisions?
It really was a sort of sense of even the decision to take on that particular story, Days of Future Past, was kind of a collective sort of hive mind thing. Marvel itself was based in New York at this time, and so they
weren't really pushing anything.
It was a matter of landlines and mailing things back and forth. The internet wasn't really available to send material. So when Eric and Mark sat down and kind of penciled out what was to have been 13 episodes for what might have been a single-run series, it was brought up to you guys, I think, that if you can use Days of Future Past in there, we'd enjoy that. From Marvel, but that was about the extent of it.
In the first 2 seasons, that was the only one they suggested. Everything else was just simply either Mark and I would find something in kind of using again Marvel Universe reference material as where if somebody were captured and enslaved, where would they enslave them? Oh, it's Genosha. It wasn't that Mark or I loved the Genosha issue. It was that we were thinking about enslaving somebody, and we looked to the Marvel, the history of the books and the stories as reference material to find the best place in the Marvel world to set the story we were trying to tell. So so as I say, in the first 26, we were obviously there were writers who knew the books and were pitching bits and say, oh, that one needs to be with the Morlocks, or that one needs to be here, and that's this story, half of which we can use part of this book to fit that. But we were starting. The perspective was, what are the stories that we can tell that best reveal our lead character? Because we had such a big cast. And TV shows live or die on whether you fall in love and get to know their cast or not. And so we were just saying, okay, what's the best Rogue story we can tell? What's the best Storm story we can tell? What's the best Wolverine story we can tell? And go into their backgrounds and who they loved and who they hated and who they betrayed, and try to fill it out and make it all about the characters. And while we were doing that, we'd take bits and pieces from the books. But it never, since Mark and I weren't fans, it didn't occur to us to ask, oh, what books should we adapt? That just wasn't the way in for us. It was through the characters.
And then with something like Days of Future Past, with the iconic story, there was a conscious decision, before, as the show got started, Kitty Pryde was not going to be a part of it. The lack of success on Pride of the X-Men, it's like, okay, a certain distancing, and trying.
And also we had Jubilee.
And you had Jubilee in place.
Right.
But then it became, okay, if we're not going to, the idea, well, what characters would be appropriate to sort of rethink the story or rework the story and to everyone's credit, the X-Men cast already was the X-Men universe is full of tremendous diversity. And again, this is 25 years ago, but the idea of coming up with a play on this story that would allow the use of a strong black male mutant, which would be Bishop, it's like, sure, that's great.
Yeah, and also we were looking for something, and Julia wrote the first half of that story. We were looking for a way in. In the book, it's like kind of Kitty, older, 40-something Kitty's soul drifts back and re-inhabits younger Kitty. And so it's, as opposed to that travel, we thought, well, it's Saturday morning, animation's kind of a more tangible medium. I just didn't feel that we could get that across terribly well. So I wanted a physical time traveler.
Right.
And so just making that one decision meant, okay, well, it's not good, and it's going to be somebody that is suspicious of the X-Men and is going to come back and is going to try to save the world by stopping an evil X-Men. And so wanted it to be a big, strong, assassin-sized guy that you could really believe, if he got hold of the wrong X-Men, could kill him. So that was, again, another good reason for picking Bishop.
Yeah. I remember that, again, watching that as a fan, I remember that was the first episode where we saw Forge, even though it was in the future.
Yes.
Yes. It was like a little Easter egg for me. It's like, oh, maybe we'll see him in the past soon, too,
I'll tell you, if you saw an Easter egg in the show, you probably did.
Yeah.
Probably hundreds of them.
And we can all thank Larry Houston for, on the artistic side of things, for him. He just was such a fan and so enjoyed it that he was doing it as much to sort of tickle himself as to hopefully for the hardcore fans who knew the books, like you go, that, it was the first time you saw Deadpool outside of the comic book.
That's
Black
right,
Panther makes a cameo appearance. All these boom, 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 boom.
It was all Larry's doing. I wouldn't have known who to put in there, and in the perfect example Larry always gives, he said, Eric, you send me the script in Genosha, and you said all these, you've got all these enslaved mutants, and you just put like mutant number 1 through 5, because for that one I didn't really have a reason for using a specific guest mutant. And he said, I'll put in. And so he and the artist just filled that one with background mutants.
We were going we were talking about Easter eggs and Larry, and we just...
Oh, no, the thing was, the odd thing to think about is that Marvel was in such financial trouble, they had sold a bunch of rights off, like Captain America and Spider-Man and various other people, and we weren't allowed to use most of the mutants that Larry snuck in. And so what he did was because he tried to put Spider-Man in an episode as just a momentary cameo, and the word came back from the attorneys, no, can't do it, don't have the rights. And Marvel wasn't integrated at the time, and they hadn't figured out this brilliant idea of, well, why don't you show everybody in the show, and then you can spin off, and people will love seeing them.
Honestly.
So almost all those things you see, the Watcher, Doctor Strange, all these people that you see in little cameos, they were just written as mutant with goatee, mutant 4 with goatee or whatever, or bald mutant with big head looks out over the cosmos. He didn't name them. And when he didn't name them and the storyboards were in black and white, none of the attorneys thought to say, no, you can't have the Watcher there. It was just a random mutant. So and he snuck in Spider-Man's wrist in one place. But he didn't say it was Spider-Man's wrist. He just says, wrist enters frame, web shoots out.
Yeah, and it got by.
I remember. I mean, we're talking about Days of Future Past. I remember Bishop sees the video game, right? And that's what jogs his memory, and it's the Punisher.
Oh my God!
It's assassin.
That was one of the most awkward. Right? I'm going to take that one to the grave. That moment where he has to remember the concept of assassin, and then the girl. That was a rough one in the writers' room to go. We got to jam this in. This has to happen like this. But it's like, this is so
kind of
awkward.
grit your teeth a little bit and just.
But then that Larry was able to use the Punisher. It's like, there's a certain genius at work here. That's beyond anything I could imagine. So yeah, those kinds of moments.
So I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry, Julia.
Well, those kind of moments have been tremendous fun to go back and sort of discover for myself. Here we are 25 years later, and it's like, oh wow, I'd forgotten that you see Doctor Strange in this moment. I'd forgot, there's Iron Man, flying through, rescuing somebody. All these little moments that it's like if you were a real fan, you really got your money's worth in terms of exposure to and to other mutants as well in the show, and that's all credit to Larry. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely my journey watching the show. It started when I was in 8th grade, and then it ended when I was in my senior year. So I sort of drifted away by the end because
But those are formative years.
They really were. They really were. And I always say, I'm like, I was a fan of the X-Men before it became too mainstream. I look at it like that indie band that goes mainstream, and then you're like, yeah. I remember before they signed on to a label. Like that was me with the X-Men. Like, because suddenly all the kids were like, I want to be Wolverine. And I'm like, man, I remember when I was the only one who knew who Wolverine was. But that's something.
And to its credit, all the young gals got to go, hey, I want to be Rogue. I want to be Storm. There wasn't fighting over. I want to be the girl.
Yeah, right.
The female X-Men were just as gave as good as they got. Were truly just equals in every respect. And in my opinion, Storm is still the strongest X-Men because she's got a tremendous amount of she can strike from a distance in a way that the other ones can't. It's much more gratifying if you're Wolverine's fan to see him go in and pound somebody, but that's not very effective, fighting strategy ultimately. So
yeah, if you're going to pick a power, I mean, control of the weather is probably where you want to end up.
Yeah. So the women were absolutely just members of the team, as were the guys, and no one was lesser than or more than. It was just truly...
It just never came up.
Yeah.
It's just they were teammates.
Yeah.
I think, well, and with that in mind, I mean, the show ends, and then 3 years later, you have the first X-Men film. Did you, when you watched that film, did you see sort of the connective tissue in that movie from what you all did on that TV show?
Well, I'm going to jump in and just say that the team that Eric and Larry and Will and they established up front, that's still the team that's in the movies. I mean, the Marvel X-Men universe is vast, and they could have picked any mutants they chose to pick, but they picked the ones that were on the team.
Also, it's a small town out here. Bryan Singer's college buddy was one of our writers, Steve
the director.
Melton. Yeah, and we'd known about the project because we'd seen an early script they'd sent it to us, to me and to Will Mineo for comments, because it seemed troubled, and it really was. It was really kind of a mess. But they ended up with a solid script, and we liked the first movie. But what we'd heard from directly, we'd seen it in print, and we'd heard it from the screenwriter, David Hayter, was that they didn't pick up a comic book. What they did was Bryan Singer and the writers just sat and watched our show. So that's what they based the movie on. And I think it's not any disrespect to the books. I just think that audiovisual writing is different from comic writing. I have no confidence that I could write a decent comic book, because I haven't tried, and it's its own craft. And I think the people making the movie felt more comfortable watching something similar, say watching the Phoenix Saga and saying, okay, here's a movie starring these guys. Let's make a much more expensive movie starring these guys.
Right. Well, and I think with I look at the first X-Men film, and I definitely I see all the ways that they learned from the animated show how to sort of boil this universe down into something that people will be able to follow. I mean, I think that the X-Men film in 2000 and Night of the Sentinels both are these perfect introductions to a completely lay person to this universe, the rules and the sort of the boundaries and expectations. I mean, it's all there.
Oh, that's very gratifying to hear that. Thank you for that.
I did have a question. This is something somebody had brought to my attention just a few weeks ago, actually. I didn't realize this. And is the similarities with the X-Men theme song from the show and the Whitney Houston song, I'm Your Baby Tonight. Have you heard of this?
We're going to have to listen now.
No, I see that a lot popping up online. Honestly, the whole theme song thing was itself a bit of a slog, because X-Men was trying to be a different kind of show, and I think it was Will and Larry who were the ones handling that. And the poor musician on this, kept submitting versions of things to them, and they kept, nope, that's not it. Nope, that's not it. Nope, that's not it. And eventually came up with that hard driving, as Eric, the difference between Batman and X-Men.
Oh, yeah. Sidney would always say, the executive that oversaw both shows, how he did that, both those two, and Spider-Man, and The Tick, and he still had time to sleep, I guess. But anyway, he said, Batman's cool jazz, and X-Men's a garage band.
How funny.
And then that was his way of, and Will Mineo was the one that was pushing Ron Wasserman, the composer, and pushing him. And I mean, there were two levels of getting the opening theme song. One was just Saban had submitted something, and Saban was very experienced in cartoon music. That was their specialty, and they would kind of just crank it out without even thinking about it and figure, okay, here's a version, sounds okay to me, slap it on the show and go next. And Will wrote back, no, this isn't good enough yet. And they went through 20, 25 attempts, and finally, okay, this is intense enough. This gets it across. And there were some nasty phone calls and, high-level people calling people, what do you mean you've got my guy working, 10 hours of overtime on this? It was perfectly good the first time. No, it wasn't. It wasn't right yet. And finally, we got the version that we all can't get out of our heads.
Right.
Right.
But at the time, I can honestly tell you, the Whitney Houston song never came up in conversation.
Okay.
But, it was in the ether, but who knows? Who knows?
It's something that literally in the last 2 weeks somebody pointed out to me, and now I can't unhear it because I'm like, that's amazing. But I mean, the ultimate testament to that theme song is that this many years later, I mean, people know it, they can hum it, and it's arguably more closely associated with the X-Men characters than any of the themes from the many films.
Oh yeah, oh absolutely, no question. Yeah, it's like we talk about things that were seminal influences and has something to do with your age at the time. But for us, Julia and I met out here in Hollywood, and we both had been hit when we were very young by the original Star Trek series, the 60s. And I've seen the movies and I've seen the shows afterwards, and to me it's still the thing that's in my head, and none of the others are. And I don't know if it's because of quality or because of when I saw it or that I saw it first, but it's what it means to me, and it will be when I'm 90.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think what you did with the X-Men animated series, you had that same impact for a whole generation of kids who grew up watching that show, and kids are still watching it. As I said, my own kids are testament to that. So it just carries on and on.
Well, as we say then, parenting done right. Introducing your kids to it. Well, good for you. Good for you.
Well, thanks. We appreciate hearing that. It means a lot to us.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk about this experience. I know it'll mean a lot to my listeners too, and I wish you all success with the book. I think 25 years later, I think 25 years from now we'll still be talking about X-Men, the animated series, and the impact that it had on children's animation.
Oh my gosh! Thank you so much for that.
Appreciate it.
So, as I said, the book is out. Is there anything else you'd like to hype up and let people know about while I have you?
We are on Twitter at X-Men TAS for the animated series, so X-Men TAS. We have a website, blog site, which is also xmentas.com, and we try and keep news about the book and availability and such on both those sites. We also have a Facebook page, which is Previously on X-Men. So we're just trying to cover as many platforms as possible so folks can come find us and hopefully find the book. Truly, it's been a labor of love on Eric's part. We were able to squirrel away a lot of production material from the series and realized, here's my other rant. Star Trek has Paramount and Warner Brothers has Batman, but dear old X-Men, the animated series, has kind of fallen through the cracks of a very ugly...
Bit of an orphan.
Yeah, very ugly
wow.
Company divorces. So we looked around and realized other things are celebrating, and no one's asking anybody about the X-Men. And thinking, I bet there's some folks out there who might, want to acknowledge this, and that's kind of, it's us. It's Eric and me, and then all the folks that he's reached out to and interviewed, making this book happen and putting it out there for fans. So we hope that folks continue to receive it as nicely as they have so far.
Well, great, and I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, and hopefully you will come back and join me for another episode, because there's plenty of other shows I would love to unpack with you.
Okay.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
And once again, big thanks to my guests, Eric and Julia Lewald, for taking the time to sit and talk to me. As we wrap things up, this is the last Nostalgia Theater of 2017, but it is not the last Nostalgia Theater. We will be back in the new year with lots of fun new episodes on deck. I'm very excited to share with you some of the interviews that I have done in recent days. Now, before I do sign off for the year, I wanted to share a new review that was left on iTunes, and to remind you to please leave more reviews for us if you can. And this is from Sean Robar, who says, really glad I found this show recently. I came for the Joe Simcoe interview. That was for the Garbage Pail Kids episode that we did earlier this year. But then had a lot of fun burning through the archive of episodes. Thank you, Sean, for writing that up. If you are liking what I'm doing, please leave a review on iTunes. Leave a star rating. Every little bit helps. If you have any suggestions for topics you'd like to see me cover in future episodes, hit me up at moviefilmpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me at my website, zackiscorner.com. That's ZAKIS Corner. That's also my Twitter. That's also my Instagram. I am available online constantly for you to pester and poke at and prod, and I'm here to do that. I'm happy to do it. So thank you once again, everybody, for making 2017 such a blast. I will see you in 2018.